Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Damon Wilson. I am delighted to be able to welcome you here for this conversation today. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Atlantic Council, and on behalf of the Council and the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, I'm delighted to welcome you to a conversation about the next era of UK defense with the British Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, who joins us during his first visit to the United States after Brexit, since Brexit. And we're delighted to be hosting this conversation at a pretty important point, not just for the United Kingdom itself, but for the transatlantic relationship more broadly. Welcome to Washington. Welcome back to the Atlantic Council. We were delighted to have the Secretary kick off our NATO Engages event in London when the Brits hosted the leaders meeting in December. He's arrived here fresh off of meetings with Secretary Esper, which I'm sure we'll get to hear a little bit about. Britain's long-anticipated departure from the European Union earlier this year, in some respects, brought finality to one set of debates while opening a series of questions and uncertainty about what the future holds for the United Kingdom's role in European and indeed global security. Britain's commitment to NATO remains ironclad. We felt and heard this message repeatedly in the hosting of the NATO leaders meeting in December. But there can be no doubt that the United Kingdom's changing relationship with Europe will have a significant impact on the future of European security and indeed implications for transatlantic security as we grapple with great power competition and a challenge from Russia, how to deal with cooperation and competition from China, terrorism, uncertainty in the Middle East, new technologies. These are areas where we know that we need Britain as a key partner. Just this last week, Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced the start of a new initiative designed to focus on the opportunity for the UK to give voice and determine its role, its place, its future in the world. And this review called an integrated review. This is something that I think we look forward to hearing of the Secretary talk a little bit about today. Secretary Wallace assumed his current role in 2019 following a distinguished career as an officer in the Scots Guard, having served as a member of Parliament, as Justice Secretary, and as the United Kingdom's longest-serving security minister. Secretary Wallace, thank you for being with us today. We're looking forward to your remarks. I also want to just give a special thanks to Ali Rogan, who is with us from PBS NewsHour, one of my favorite shows, who will be moderating our discussion today. And before I turn over the podium, I just want to encourage all of you here, all of you that are watching and participating online, to join the conversation using the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. With that, the podium is yours, sirs.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak. It's my first speech to a US think tank, so be gentle. The previous job as security minister, we didn't do much media, and we didn't get many questions. Well, we did, but no one ever knew how bad they were answered because they were always asked by security and intelligence services. So it was part of the best job. I could always say to the public, we never comment on intelligence matters when things got difficult, and move on. Look, I'm delighted to be back here in the US. I did last come and visit as security minister, and indeed my parents lived in Pennsylvania for nearly 10 years, so I'm not a stranger to these streets, let's say. And it's a privilege to address the Atlantic Council because it's such a great champion of our transatlantic relationship. Your advice has always been insightful, always impartial, and always welcome. And you've always managed to gather not just thinkers, but doers around the table. People with vision to get things done. Do you know, it's a tragic fact that if we managed only half the number of global deaths from conflict by 2030, we will only return to 2010 levels. Since the beginning of the last decade, the number of major violent conflicts has tripled. And in 2016, more countries experienced violent conflict than at any time in the previous 30 years. Displacement and despair are running at significant levels. Security and stability a distant memory for some. The West took for granted the peace dividend at the end of the Cold War. Treasuries cashed in, and our armies consolidated their methods and formations. But our adversaries did not do the same. They studied our vulnerabilities, stole our technologies, and invested where we did not. As the Russian chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov, himself said, the rules of the game have changed. Fast forward to today, and our adversaries are using proliferation, misinformation, and proxies, state and non-state, to extend their interests. They feed off instability and division. knowing that they have the advantage often of autocracy and disregard for the international rules-based system. No doubt, they're often amusing themselves as they watch our political and legal systems self-tightening a straitjacket of permissions and authorities that make it hard for us to respond. To some, the solution to this new challenge is isolationism, to focus only on the homeland. To others, it is to appease. I've often marveled at how governments in the West call out China for debt diplomacy in the third world, but when it's close to our shores, we call it foreign direct investment. Well, why is it when some nations in Europe are every day attacked by Russian cyber-state actors, they hide it from their own populations and instead reach out to Moscow rather than seeking to change their behavior? But not everyone is prepared to ignore the growing threat environment. Ask the people of Ukraine or in Scandinavia how they feel about their neighbours' malign activity. They live with hybrid warfare every day. Or those countries in the Pacific whose right to freedom of navigation is challenged by China and who are often punished for standing up to a regional superpower. I'm here today to say that neither course, isolationism or appeasement, is the right one to take. There are powerful values-based and global public good arguments why the UK and the US should care about conflict and stability overseas based on a moral imperative, a force for good, to reduce the loss of life and human suffering and indirectly enable a more prosperous, inclusive, peaceful and sustainable world. In this ever more transactional time, I recognise that these arguments alone aren't always enough to bring over public opinion. So I want to set out three core arguments why it is in the UK's core interests and why we in the UK should be prepared to resource it to address conflict and instability overseas. Not only to devote the resources necessary to achieve these goals, but in our hard-headed national interest to do so as well. The first reason is that conflict threatens UK national security at home and abroad. Strife creates the breeding ground for terrorists and extremists to thrive. In the lawless spaces that spring from the absence of formal government, nefarious groups opposed to the UK, its allies and its interests are able to grow, feeding off a population's resources and siphoning their supplies of weaponry. Al-Qaeda grew in Afghanistan, ISIS in Syria and Iraq, Boko Haram in Nigeria. Significantly, a study by the Institute for Economics and Peace found that between 1989 and 2014, less than 1% of terrorist incidents occurred in countries without either ongoing conflict or some form of political terror. But conflict also creates the instability that allows our adversaries to pursue their foreign policy aims. Look, for example, at how Iran and Russia are sowing confusion and threatening Western interests across the Middle East and North Africa. Russia is doing the same in Ukraine and the Caucasus. Meanwhile, war and instability stir up the fog of uncertainty behind which hostile actors, state or non-state, hide and act with impunity. And as I know all too well from my days as a security minister, conflict enables serious, organised criminal activity to operate unchecked. Wars in the Middle East and Africa, the Sahel, West and East Africa have turbocharged the drugs, weapons and people smuggling rings out of Western Asia and North Africa into Europe. From Afghanistan to Yemen, Somalia to Syria, dangers to UK national security have been exacerbated by the chaos of conflict overseas. And what's more, conflict is contagious. As refugees move from one fragile state to another, so borders become the centre of illegal trade and political systems become strained. Lebanon is on the edge of conflict with potential impacts for regional and European security. Conflict in Somalia threatens the security of over 30,000 UK nationals in Kenya, as well as our economic interests and the interests of our friend and ally, Kenya. And there is the secondary issues too. Refugees and migrants, with no hope of a better life and no prospect of a return to their own homes, are increasingly seeking refuge in the West. The crisis of 2015 is a reminder of the political instability that follows in their wake alongside the repellent rise of racist political parties across recipient and transit countries. So conflict threatens our security directly, but it also reduces our prosperity, damaging economic growth amongst key potential markets and trading partners, reducing even middle-income countries such as Syria, Libya or Venezuela to abject poverty. The statistics paint a graphic picture. As well as the loss of life, Conflict causes an average loss of annual GDP growth of 2 to 8.4%. It costs a medium-sized developing country the equivalent of 30 years of GDP growth. Even countries bordering a conflict zone suffer on average 1.4% decline in annual GDP. Conflict undermines governance, damages basic services, and adversely affects the availability of natural resources such as oil and strategic minerals. So Iranian hostile activity in the Gulf creates spikes in the oil price, while turmoil in the DRC restricts the availability of minerals such as cobalt and coltan, essential elements in making everything from hearing aids to mobile phones. Conflict also provides the perfect conditions for pandemic diseases to emerge and thrive. Ebola sprang up in the DRC, Liberia and Sierra Leone, the three countries unable to eradicate polio: Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. Today, we need no reminding how easy it is for disease to rapidly spread out of control. But in the long term, conflict breeds conflict by entrenching grievance, empowering criminals and crime bosses who sometimes become the ruling political classes. 60% of current conflicts are sequels of previous wars, while some have put the annual cost of conflict in excess of $13 trillion. But that's why my third point is that preventing conflict is one of the main ways a country like the UK can exercise its power for good in the international system. Some remain firmly opposed to particular forms of military intervention. However, we cannot ignore the value we bring by getting involved when it's in our interest to do so. Not only does it maintain our important engagement with other great powers at the top table, for example, the United Nations Security Council, but it also helps extend our influence to countries whose political systems are in flux. By shaping peace settlements and playing our part in post-conflict reconstruction, we can provide a moderating influence, helping promote our values and compete with our ideological rivals. This in turn enhances our reputation across the world and opens up opportunities to further other UK objectives. In the past 2 decades, we've helped tackle Ebola in Sierra Leone, provided vital humanitarian aid in Kosovo, led NATO efforts to stop genocide in parts of the former Yugoslavia, supported allies in Oman, in Brunei, and in Jordan. These efforts have had a huge role in enhancing the reputation of the UK around the globe. And the reality is, you can't begin to tackle climate change or world poverty or violence against women and girls without addressing the underlying conflicts that make the situations work. So having left the European Union, the UK wishes to seize the opportunities that an independent country can have. We are free to trade with who we like and to join common cause with who we like. But we also remain strongly committed to a world in which the Western values of justice, tolerance, and liberty are free to flourish. We believe that the world is in everyone's best interests. We believe those type of values are in the world's best interests. That's why our contribution to security, whether on the European continent or further afield, remains iron-cast. The security of Europe is vital to the UK's security. That will not change just because we have left the political union of the European Union. And of course, NATO remains the cornerstone of that security, a proven and unparalleled defensive alliance, our best means of countering Russian malign activity and hostility. But the United States will always be the indispensable actor in our alliance. Now, we're immensely grateful for the way the United States have upped the contribution to the alliance, not least through the Readiness Initiative. And we also got the White House memo that Europe shouldn't take the US for granted, or indeed the US taxpayer for granted. We know that our allies must do more to carry burden of collective defence. The UK is certainly doing its bit. We are a vital contributor to NATO's nuclear umbrella. We've made the largest single commitment to the Readiness Initiative, and we are committed to the above 2% of GDP spend on defence. And the government has said that this integrated review will not be cost neutral. At the same time, we continue to champion NATO's transformation and togetherness. Alliance solidarity has kept us safe for more than 70 years. We can't let competitors like Russia divide us. So the more allies can do to pay their way, the more work we can do to modernize their capabilities, the more we can do to prevent the US from facing challenges on 2 fronts, and the better for us all. So that's why the UK must reduce, in my view, the 2010 SDSR's overdependence on US support. Britain will always aim to deploy and fight in all terrains, but at times we and our allies will need to do so without US force protection or ISR capabilities. Not perhaps in high-intensity or peer-to-peer warfare, but in counter-terrorism operations or in theatres where we face sometimes more direct threats. Burden sharing sometimes means carrying the responsibility of leadership and framework so our allies can focus elsewhere. Critically, this will be one of the considerations in our integrated foreign security and defence review. It will ensure that we understand tomorrow's threats as well as today's. It will help cement our status as a forward-looking and outward-reaching nation willing to shoulder responsibility and take the lead, and where our interests are at stake. From a defence perspective, it will be our guiding light in modernising and shaping our capabilities, making defence the spear of global Britain. So we intend to carry out a full 360-degree exercise examining what we do and how we do it. My intention is not to prejudge the outcomes of the review, but we won't just be looking at where NATO and the UK can do what it can do more independently, but where the UK can also collaborate more with the United States. Rest assured, we are determined to remain interoperable with our closest ally, the United States. We're already working together closely on a vast range of capabilities, from common missile compartments to P-8 maritime patrol aircraft. We remain the only day one, tier one partner capable of fighting alongside the US in the most contested environments. The review is working on 4 main work streams: the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, great power competition, global issues, and homeland security. And it's very important to us in the United Kingdom that our allies contribute to this process. The US, NATO, allies and industry, their views will be vital. We also need to ask how we can do more to collaborate with the US and Five Eyes to build wider alliance and resilience in areas where we are currently being tested. Our adversaries are constantly probing and damaging us, from the hybrid dangers emanating from Russia, China and Iran in the grey zone, to the danger our adversaries are posing to us in space, the need for more cyber to protect us in cyberspace, more SIGINT, more electronic warfare and special operations capabilities, will mean we should work even more strongly with the US, pushing back the malign intentions and exposing aggression wherever we find it. None of us can meet the challenge of persistence alone. Under my leadership, I'm determined that the Ministry of Defence adopts a more campaigning posture, since we must recognise that the threat no longer resides in the official definition of peace and war, but in the constant. Alongside considerations of our defence posture, technology will always be a key feature, and therefore it's going to be heart of our integrated review. As our adversaries strive to whittle away our leading edge, we need to modernise faster, getting ahead of the curve in everything from space and cyberspace to AI and big data. We are still in the early days of the review. There is plenty more to come. So we have arrived at a critical moment in our nation's history. For more than 100 years, the US and the UK, by standing together in the Great War, the Second World War, the Cold War, and not to mention many more recent operations against extremism, we have helped freedom and prosperity flourish. As we enter a new area of conflict, some have questioned why the US and UK should care about the stability of other nations. But with threats multiplying across the globe, and with the past decade witnessing repeated global declines in political rights and civil liberties, our answer to those skeptics is simple enough. It remains in our own interest to get involved. If we don't stand up to be counted, who will? And if we don't act, what will the consequences be for our people and for the world? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary of State. And in the interest of making best use of the time that we have left with you, I want to begin straight to some of my questions, and then hopefully we'll have time for a few audience questions. So first, I want to get to something that I think is the biggest issue on the minds of the United States with regard to its relationship with the UK. I know you discussed it a little bit already in your press conference with Secretary Esper, but on the issue of Huawei. When the UK was first debating whether and how involved they wanted Huawei to be in their 5G infrastructure. You were reportedly someone in the room who was a dissenting voice and was trying to convince the Prime Minister not to go along with Huawei. So I wonder, can you tell us the argument that you were making at that time? And also, what convinced you that, in fact, incorporating Huawei's programs would not compromise British security?
Well, I think, and I'm not going to comment on the discussions of an NSC meeting. Look, I think what I would say is that, first of all, we started at a different starting point with 5G in Huawei. Our network is more advanced. 5G is round the corner, indeed, starting to actually be rolled out. And nearly, I think, the whole of the United Kingdom is 4G already. That means we have a greater challenge about just overnight deciding to strip out 5G Huawei equipment. And indeed, it also went to the heart of predominantly a technical dispute. You know, when the director of GCHQ and the technical support amongst them say to me to my face, and these are the same people I've worked with them for the last 3 years, seeing what they can achieve, that they believe it is possible in the commercial part of our network to mitigate 5G. I have to believe that. They're the professionals. I'm not, not the head of one of the most successful intelligence services in our history. And so accepting their technical advice is part of it. The second bit is the wider policy, where we took a decision that we would ban them and have banned them from the core of our sensitive network. So the networks I operate on as Defence Secretary, they're not in it. Our intelligence agency networks, they're not in it. They're not part of that network at all. In the commercial private sector where people are doing their day-to-day business, we have said we will cap them as being 35% off the outside of it. And then we have a commitment to cut them. We're going to cut them out. We're going to work to try and get them out of our network. There is still decisions and discussions to be had about how long that should take. And that is a position that I think, to be fair, the United States does understand. And then the bigger question is really about China and how we deal with China. Britain's decision on 5G is not driven because we have a different view of China. You know, Mark Esper and I entirely agree on the threat that emanates from China and China's activities and behavior. The difference is currently how to mitigate it. Some on the Hill, I think, have interpreted the position that we went a different way as not thinking China is an adversarial threat. That's not correct. So that's where we're at on the 5G. And you know, I'll leave the technological experts to argue out the differences. But you know, as we saw in the American system, I think you discovered you had quite a lot of 5G. I saw we passed $1 billion this week on the Hill to take it out of some of the county networks that were already there. So some of this is about, I think we should both be asking a much bigger question. It's when China entered the sort of capitalist world all those years ago, well, not that long ago, none of us seemed to put any conditions on it. I think we had optimism that somehow they would all embrace all the other rules that went with it. And we wake up to find that, you know, they own Walmart, they've invested in our universities and everywhere else. And that frustration, I understand in both political systems and in people, but we're going to have to deal with the here and now and how we move forward.
And to that point, though, you know, your point is well taken that so many of these decisions are operating on a technical level that is far beyond, I know, my understanding or comprehension, and probably a lot of people who aren't telecoms experts. However, what is clear is that there is great disagreement on the technical level about how insidious some of this technology is and how much you can actually separate some of the, you know, the core from the edge, which is what Britain has said how it wants to incorporate 5G. If I can read something just based on the fact that you're saying that you've taken your guidance from obviously some of Britain's intelligence experts, which is well taken, but here's what Simeon Gilding, who was up until December 2019 the head of Australia's Signals Directorate's Signals Intelligence and Offensive Cyber Missions, he says that the distinction between core and edge is not as applicable in the case of 5G as it was in 4G networks. That, quote, all network functionality in 5G is virtualized and takes place within a single cloud environment. That means there is no physical or logical separation between the core and the edge of the network. So the argument that you're making is that you're going to keep Huawei to the periphery, but many experts are arguing that that's actually not something that can be done. What do you say to that?
Well, I'm not going to denigrate another country's expert. You know, I stand by Cheltenham, GCHQ, you know, born out of Bletchley Park, people that every day produce technology, understand vulnerabilities in other people's technologies, hence the reason things like GCHQ and the NSA are world leaders. They understand vulnerabilities, and if GCHQ had said the opposite, then we would have taken a different decision. You know, that these are my intelligence leaders, highly respected, and I'm sure if you ask the Australians or the United States, they will entirely respect their position. They may disagree with some of the technical issues. I'm not in the world where I'm just going to ignore what these people said, and I think that was the basis of the decision. How we then implement the decision was obviously part of the bigger discussion. But look, you know, GCHQ, in my experience as security minister and in my time, have some of the world leading experts, and if they say that, then I'm not going to discard that.
One of the other questions as we look at the US and UK relationship with regard to 5G is at the beginning of this conversation, the United States was saying that it may curtail its intelligence sharing with the UK if the UK did in fact decide to move forward with Huawei. In recent days, however, Secretary Pompeo did seem to pull back on that, saying that our relationship will remain strong, that the Five Eyes that share intelligence will remain integral. So I want to know what is your understanding of the situation in terms of the U.S. approach? Has anything changed in terms of your intelligence sharing relationship with the United States since this decision has gone into effect?
I mean, at present, nothing has changed in the intelligence sharing, but I think that's partly because, as I said earlier, in our intelligence networks, there is no Huawei. There is no in our sensitive comms and systems we use, they're not in it. So
physically,
they're not physically in it. I mean, they're not.
But is that really the distinction that matters here?
Well, I think it's again. I mean, you know, I think you have to ask the technical experts about the exact construct of a separate air-walled network, but certainly they are not in our intelligence networks, and as a result, we maintain those strong relationships with the United States intelligence services, and also, I think people remember. Everyone knows that intelligence is not a competition; it's a partnership. Intelligence is two-way. Mm-hmm. We share and originate lots of intelligence that we share with the United States. And we share with the Australians and New Zealanders, and the Five Eyes is a collaboration often. Some of the, what I learned when I looked at operational plots in my previous job is you're only as good as your last intercept or your last piece of small intelligence sometimes. And any country that takes a generic sort of, we're not doing that, could potentially expose themselves to their own safety issues. So the professionals, they know that. They know that's where we're going. And I think the real political debate, my view, is really above that. It's about this question of China's relationship with international rules and the norms, and in exchange for access to our markets, our intellectual property, our universities, our peoples across the West, what does it need to do that? Mm-hmm. And I think that is a much bigger issue, but that is, to me, the big political debate to come.
Sure. We so many more questions I'd love to ask you, but I do want to open it up to audience questions. What I want to do is ask that you identify yourself, limit your questions to just a few sentences, no analysis, please. I'm going to collect 2 questions at one time just so we can go, and we've got Sir in the red and then Madam sitting to his left. Thank you. Or right. Your left. Sir, yes.
My name is Don Kirk. I'm a journalist. How much confidence do you have that President Trump really shares your enthusiasm for NATO and for the defense of Europe? He's been quite critical. This is not analysis, but he's been quite critical of how much the various members of NATO are putting up in numbers So how confident are you that he won't suddenly pull the rug out from under NATO? Thank you.
And would you pass the microphone to the lady next to you?
I beg your pardon?
Would you mind passing? I'm just going to collect 2 questions at once so that we can take them in rapid fire. So
sorry.
would you? Nope, right there, next on the other side. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sylwia Szaflowska. I'm an assistant defense attaché here in Washington, D.C. And
Yeah, for whom? May I ask?
Poland, assistant
Thank you.
defense attaché here. Having graduated from the Sussex University program, postgraduate studies on European integration, I would be very happy to hear, the European cooperation angle, what you foresee for the future beyond the NATO scope. So what is the, basically, I know we are in the States and that's the main focus for you here, but if you could, expand on that, because we understand that you will focus more on NATO than European Union, but if you could show us, certain pathways, what you think that defense cooperation will go to.
I mean, I could probably answer both questions because the pivot on the NATO. Look, at the NATO summit in December, I had a conversation with the President and indeed Mark Esper, the National Security Advisor. And look, President Trump has been actually quite right. He's put pressure on a lot of these countries who have actually increased their spending. I mean, it has worked. I think they've increased, I think it's extra 400 billion, I think is the figure, of increased defense spending, with even more committed up to 2030. So saying parts of Europe have to pull their weight and driving towards that 2% has been successful. And I think, actions speak louder than words. President Trump, the US defense establishment, Mark Esper, they recognize NATO is the cornerstone of Europe. And indeed, as you saw, when post-Soleimani, the issues around Iraq, etc., President Trump reached for NATO. He said NATO should do more and would like NATO to explore doing more in that part of the world, which is what we are doing. So I think I'm pretty confident that he recognizes, well, I know he does, that NATO is important and key to security in many parts of the world, and I think that will continue. That also transfers into the European policy area. The security of Europe has been guaranteed by NATO for decades. And Poland especially, the Baltic states, the Scandinavian states that I work with, even the ones not in NATO, see NATO is really one of the key parts of that European defence. What they don't say in the same breath is NATO and a European army or anything. They don't talk like that. What my experience of European defence has been, at a European sort of continental level, they actually are about the willing. There are 2 types of European military power, in my view, or military contributors. Those that do, and those that talk about it. And there's those that spend on it, and those that don't. And what we've found in history is non-NATO issues, the willing get together. Denmark and Britain, for example, and Germany and Holland in Afghanistan will be together, contributing soldiers and producing new formations. We've got the Joint Expeditionary Force. We've got the Northern group of ministers from the Scandinavian countries, where we get to work with non-NATO countries such as Finland and Sweden. And we're doing things. We're not just talking about it. We did a joint exercise, Baltic Defender. So I think post-Europe, security of Europe is important for the United Kingdom, but there are a lot of countries in Europe who still believe in the bilateral relationship, or indeed keeping defence there preserve if they're not in the NATO alliance, or if they're not going to use NATO alliance, in order to find the most appropriate partners to deliver a task, whether that's seeing a threat a long way away or whether defending from Russian hybrid activity, for example.
We have about 2 minutes left, so with the audience's indulgence, I'm going to reclaim my tyranny as moderator and ask one short final question, which is piggybacking off of these, and the question of NATO, which is, do you believe, given everything that's happening in Idlib province right now in Syria, does NATO have an obligation to assist its ally, its partner Turkey, in their fight against the Russians and the Assad regime, with the understanding that just a few hours ago a ceasefire was announced? It hasn't gone, I believe it's just gone into effect, but the situation obviously remains fluid, so perhaps there may be an opportunity for those questions to reemerge.
I wouldn't necessarily say NATO. I think there's a obligation on most of the civilized countries in the world to deal with what is a massively emerging humanitarian crisis in Idlib. I mean, what is going on under the Assad and Russia regime is tantamount to war crimes. I mean, they are bombing, and I think it is clearly the intention of the Assad regime to flatten Idlib and drive whoever's left across the border into Turkey, and that is not good for Turkey. Turkey already has 3.6 million refugees. That is not good for, obviously, the observance of human rights, and we should find lots of ways that we can to ensure that doesn't deteriorate any further. And whether, I don't think necessarily has to be a NATO thing. I think there are a lot of countries, European countries, the United States, neighbours, who can see where this is heading, and think we have to do something. We're going to definitely. I'm off to Turkey next week. My foreign secretary was there at the beginning of this week. The first thing we're doing is doing more aid to help with the impact of the refugees. I will sit down with the Turks and discuss with them how we can help in their security in their country. That's important. And then I think we'll all have to discuss what next in Idlib. But let's remember, this is a Assad regime assisted by Russia. And let's not forget, the assisted by Russia is quite important. If you saw the ITV news in Britain yesterday, you would have seen the report of one of their brave reporters got inside Idlib, and you saw Russian airplanes dropping pretty randomly munitions on innocent people, and we've seen hospitals hit and everything else. So I wouldn't use NATO any more than anything else. I think we all have a duty to it.
But we do have obligations. NATO does have obligations under the North Atlantic Treaty, no?
If they're invoked by Turkey. I mean, Turkey is the member. There's been a meeting and a joint declaration at NATO already to discuss it. We have obligations under Article 5 if that's invoked, but there are obviously conditions around all of those things. Yes. But there's lots of things to deal with.
Sure. Thank you so much,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Secretary of Defense.
Nice,
I think we all appreciate your candor and coming out here. May I ask the audience to please remain seated while we allow the Secretary and his staff to exit the room and get on to your next meeting?
I'm sorry I can't stay longer. I would like to, but I'm off to see somebody.
I will have another, and my colleagues will have another bite at the apple when you join us on the PBS NewsHour for an interview this evening. So
Good.
please stay
Thank you very
tuned.
much.
If I
Thank
can
you.
end with that shameless plug.
Thank you.